I read White Sand Volume 1 by Brandon Sanderson. This is the graphic novel and not the prose written version of the story that's available that I'm talking about. And I read this for the Summer of Cosmere project that I'm doing, which is about reading all of the Cosmere in the published order of each of the stories, including, obviously, short stories like this. And so I'm going to be talking about the connections between the stories, so you might encounter spoilers for stuff like Elantris and Mistborn and the Stormlight Archive, so watch out for that. So Volume 1 introduces us to the two main characters of the story. I'd say Kenton, who is kind of the main character, if I could say that weird way again. And he is a sandmaster who lives on the day side of the world. And then the other main character is Chrysala, who comes from the night side of the world or dark side of the world. The planet itself is an interesting setting. Sanderson is really good at developing these settings for his fantasy universe that feel very influenced by science fiction, in thinking through the actual physics of, planetary mechanics and things like that. And so the world that this takes place on is called Taldane, where one side of the world is because the planet is tidally locked, one side of the world is always facing the sun. That's the day side, and one side is always facing away. And then there's kind of an intermediary zone, obviously in between them, and we'll get more information about that in a later publication. But the point being that there's kind of two different societies that are strongly separated by this divide, and that they also have distinct skin tone differences and also are deeply culturally detached from each other. They have different languages, they have different ways of dressing, and different levels of technology. The day side is kind of considered to be more primitive. They're using spears and swords, things like that, while the dark side of the world has weapons like guns. And because this is a graphic novel, I think a lot of the world building that's happening in the story is also visual. And so the characters from the dark side have polarized glasses that they wear, like sunglasses, to protect their eyes from the sun, obviously. But also the way that they dress is more complicated and sophisticated than the kind of robes and wrapping of long cloths that the Daysiders are doing as well. And so visually, I think what it gives you just immediately upon seeing the characters is that even down to their textiles, the things that they're wearing, there's a higher level of technological sophistication on the dark side of the world versus the day side of the world. And all of those differences, I think, are important because Kenton is a character of mixed heritage. His mother was from Darkside. His father is the leader of the Sandmasters on the day side. And so his heritage comes from both sides of the world. And I think he kind of embodies something totalizing about the world in that way, symbolically. He is a character who takes up this kind of liminal space in the same way that Wax from Mistborn Era 2 does, where he, has this heritage of being a noble who comes from the High Lords of Elendel, but also he has Terrace heritage. And then on top of that, he, leaves the city to go out into the roughs and becomes a roughs lawman and comes back to the city. And so he has this liminal presence where he has a foot in the kind of savage world of the roughs and the refined world of Elendel, but also the terrace culture and the noble culture of the valley. In the same way, Kenton has he knows how to speak the language of the dark side and has been raised in the culture of Dayside and has been trying very, very hard his entire life to get the approval of his father, Lord Maestral Praxton, who, as the master of the Sandmasters, is mostly interested in like power levels of people. So the Sandmasters are the people who wield investiture on the Dayside, and the way that they're using magic is kind of like almost like a telekinesis that is directly tied to sand itself. And since the Dayside is tidally locked to always be facing the sun, there is very little water on the surface of the world, and much of the world is a desert on that side, which means there's lots and lots of sand. And then this sand is somehow invested, and the Sandmasters connect with that investiture and then are able to manipulate the sand kind of telekinetically, like I said. So there's this interior control of the sand that looks very familiar when we think about the way that the Mistborns control their powers, through the intention of pushing and pulling without giving like any kind of verbal commands whatsoever, unlike in Warbreaker, for example, or Elantris. And then just like Kaladin in the Stormlight Archive, Kenton is like controlling this ribbon of sand that he can use and moving it around with his mind in the same way that Kaladin controls his orientation to gravity based on his like internal mental intentions. And so the link that they have with investiture is internal, I guess is what I'm saying, and not directly linked to language. But I think Sanderson is still interested in language in this story because one of the first things that we see about Kenton is that, as he's trying to prove himself to his father, because Kenton is like very, very weak in the sand mastery power, his father is skeptical that he should be involved in the DM or the community of Sandmasters. Kenton has been forced to learn the very complicated laws and rules about his society in order to advocate for himself and like a position in the society. And so the Sandmasters are very hierarchical in the way that they rank each other, and it's all based on power, like I said. But they have like these belts that they give out. It very much reminds me of like, like karate in the West and things like that, where you have, all of these different colors of belts. And it works really well for a graphic novel, I think, that you can see people wearing the different colored belts and understand that, this one is more powerful than that one. And it seems to be what they indicate. But since Kenton can only control one ribbon of sand, whereas most of the, even low-level or mediocre Sandmasters can control a dozen, his father thinks that it's just a waste of time to have him there at all. But where language comes into it for Kenton is that he has to point out the very specific language and rules of the society in order to force his father to allow him into the DM. So, for example, just the ability to manipulate any sand at all means that you have to be accepted into the DM, and that the Sandmaster like has no real control over that acceptance. And so his father can't bar him from joining the society, even though he is the person who is in control of giving higher ranks and more elevated status. And so the way that Kenton has compensated for his lack of raw power is through competence of using his one ribbon to do things that the other Sandmasters just kind of, they don't have to achieve that level of mastery in order to get the same kind of job done, which means that Kenton knows all kinds of little tricks and in general is more resilient than any of the other Sandmasters. But his father won't recognize this resilience or competence because he doesn't value that very much. This goes right back to the theme that has been so important lately in the Cosmere that has to do with like stories like Sixth of Dusk or Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. And even, lately in Mistborn Era 2, where we're looking at the differences between societies and how that relates to the difficulties that those people have faced, or the versus like the ease of life. So in Mistborn, you have the people who live in Ellendale. The land is like extremely fertile. It's very easy to grow crops there. And the weather is mild. Like everything is just kind of in favor of the people who live in that area, as compared to the people the Malwish that we encountered at the end of Bands of Mourning, who are from the other side of the world and have dealt with extreme weather conditions, a lack of allomancers, and just like a huge amount of hardships going all the way back to the beginning of the Lord Ruler's time. And that has cultivated in them a certain kind of resilience, a completely different way of organizing their society, and a technological advancement in terms of their use of investiture that far outclasses the society that, we've mostly encountered through the two eras of Mistborn so far. In the same way, in Six of Dusk, Dusk himself is far more resilient than the mainlanders who come to Pachi and get themselves killed by, things as small as ants, but also carnivorous plants and all of the various dangers that exist on that island, because he has put in the time to become competent and self-reliant. And so there's a value to the difficulty and hardship that he has gone through that is just like an intrinsic part of what makes his character better than the other characters who have had it easier. I think Kenton borrows from this same tradition in the Cosmere. He's able to do things with his one ribbon of sand that it takes somebody else a dozen ribbons of sand to accomplish the same thing. And so what he advocates to his father to be allowed to do at the beginning of the story is this Maestral's Path trial that is supposed to be reserved for the masters, like the high-level people in the Diem, where they kind of like show off their powers, or it's like a drill or practice sort of, where there's these hidden orbs out in the desert, and it's a timed thing where you are observed by other masters, and you have to go out and collect as many of the 5 orbs as you can find in the limited amount of time that you have. And the different trials of this path show the different abilities that you have to master as a practitioner of this kind of investiture. And so it's a really difficult trial, basically, that usually only masters do, and even the masters who do it fail to accomplish to find all 5 of them most of the time. And his father is like, no, you can't do this. It's a thing for masters only. But again, because Kenton is like deeply in touch with the rules and language of his society, he points out that there is nothing in particular in the law that prohibits, a member of the Diem who is of low ranking from doing it. They just don't usually do it because it's kind of crazy. And his father is like, even if you do this and you get all 5 of them, I'm not going to make you a master. Like, you need to just give up on this. And so that kind of antagonism between the father and son is a theme that we've seen, going all the way back to Elantris. You think about Raoden and his father's relationship is very fraught. They don't see eye to eye on the way that the new kingdom should be ruled and the kind of dynasty will be established going forward. The same thing with Elendventure and his father, having a lot of schism between them, not seeing eye to eye about what is valuable in a leader or how their house should be run. And even Adolin and Dalinar to a certain degree, where, in the Way of Kings, Adolin is really worried about Dalinar's ability to lead the house because he's showing weakness in ways that is inappropriate for an Alethi High Lord. And so he's constantly kind of pushing for his father to step down or lead in a different way. And I think that Kenton has more in common with the first two examples, where he's taking a more righteous and inclusive position. But there is this kind of like resistance between father and son. And I think a big part of Kenton's personality is built on the fact that he has like gotten into this habit of resisting authority because it is authority. Like, it's not necessarily just about like his father is being unfair or failing to recognize the value of his magical abilities. It's just that he's been fighting with his father for so long that anything that his father says is the wrong way to do things. And I don't even think that Kenton, at this point in the story, knows how to see any wisdom in his father's choices. Because on a certain level, I think his dad is just trying to protect him, not only from the dangers of the Maestrel's path itself, but the humiliation of being in this DM and not having power. Also, the resentment that it will bring out that, there's a kind of nepotism that could happen if he promotes his son, who, even though he is highly competent with his one ribbon of sand, is, not valued by the culture that all of the maesters share. And so it would look, when he elevates Kenton, it would look as if he's just doing it because they are related to each other. And that will make everybody hate Kenton in a way that's not fair to him. But I don't think Kenton can see any of that. And also the story itself, I don't think wants us to emotionally have empathy for Kenton's father in that way. The story wants us to feel like all of this is very unfair and that his father is an unreasonable dictator, which is mostly true. In any case, he goes through the trial. He successfully locates not only all 5 of them, but there is a 6th one that is kind of embedded in this monster that lives within the area of the trial. That is like a big surprise and part of what makes the trial so difficult. And we find out that one of the magical abilities that these maesters have is called slatrification, where you kind of transform the sand itself into water, which is important because when you're using this magical power, for whatever reason, it takes water out of the body of the Sand Master and uses it as the investiture is being expended. So something like the way that Shallan or Kaladin use Stormlight during the use of their abilities, and that Stormlight is constantly running out, or the Allomancers are burning metal, and if their metal burns out, then they lose their powers. In the same way, if you get too dehydrated, you're not going to be able to use your powers, or if you just push yourself too far, your body will totally dry out and you'll die. So there's this kind of like maximum limitation to using your powers biologically, like you're just going to die if you push it too hard, unless you slatrify the sand, which, kind of gives up your ability to use that sand for whatever, use it might have. But again, you're like on a desert planet, where most everything is sand. So you can afford to turn it into water and then drink that water and continue to use your powers more. Additionally, a lot of the big monsters, like this one that lives in the Maestral's Path trial, have a carapace that like their outer layer of their body responds to water as if it was like acid or something. Like it just washes away their armor and exposes the flesh itself, and then that makes them vulnerable in all kinds of ways. So basically the monsters are all allergic to water. So being able to turn sand into water, turns it into a weapon against this kind of creature. Kenton is not powerful enough to achieve this effect, though. So when he faces the monster, he doesn't have any way to fight back. However, he uses a sword and also has been trained in how to fight by the local guards from the nearby town, which is like a whole thing that all of the Sandmasters disdain. They think that using a sword and, learning martial arts and things like that is useless because, like, if you have these magical powers, why would you bother to learn how to use weapons and whatnot? It reminds me a lot of the Elantrians and, like the things that we hear about them 10 years before what happens with Ryota, and how they didn't have a military, how they, built everything out of their magical powers instead of learning, how to unlock the kind of natural science ways of doing things. Because, like, since you have this ease of magic, why would you ever need to learn how to make things that don't run on magic? But you see the effect of what happens with that, because when the magic broke down, then all of Elantris instantly became like kind of cursed and stopped working properly. So in the same way, like, this is another example of how Kenton has compensated through hardship to find competency. He's using the sword to supplement his lack of magical ability, but in situations like this where he's facing this monster, it gives him a weapon that a Sandmaster usually wouldn't use. And so his self-reliance becomes a virtue in the story, where he's able to peel away part of its natural armor and expose its body, and then kind of pushes in his ribbon of sand into its body, and then uses his very fine control over it to zip around the inside of its body and destroy its brain. And he actually kills the monster, which we find out later has been there for centuries, and no one has ever been able to defeat it. So he does what was impossible for all the other masters who went down this path. And then he obtains the sixth sphere that was embedded in its body and goes back. And it's kind of like undeniable that he achieved the impossible with his abilities. And, what it puts his father in this kind of difficult position where he has to acknowledge what Kenton has achieved. But I think it just heightens the resentment between the two of them ultimately. There's a ceremony that follows this where they award the members their new rank that they've earned, and we meet a character named Dryle, who is around the same age as Kenton and has managed to make Kenton's father angry as well for completely different reasons, and gets demoted, which is something that is unprecedented, but shows how Kenton's father is willing to use his power in kind of brutal or humiliating ways. Then he offers Kenton of an extremely low rank, an even lower rank than he was being offered before he went down the Maestral's path. And Kenton refuses to be ranked so low given his accomplishments. I think this is important for his character and also for like the theme of this planet's investiture and its association with the shard that it is a part of, that Kenton like stands up for himself. He even though he desperately wants his father's love and approval and acceptance and to be a part of this community, the fact that the community rejects him so strongly and is so unjust to him is the source of what makes him singular and kind of virtuous within the kind of moral margins of this particular shard of autonomy. So we've seen shards like preservation, ruin, honor, cultivation, and they all have slightly different morality, which I've been talking about for the past couple of episodes. And autonomy, obviously is about self-reliance. And the fact that this community has particular values that automatically exclude Kenton, I think, is part of what makes him valuable to the shard itself. And it's an example, a kind of counterexample to the claim that I've been making all along, that community helps to lift us up. It helps to compensate for the failings and weaknesses of the characters in the Cosmere, and that it's necessary for personal progression, towards the good in the Cosmere overall. In this case, the community is required for Kenton's advancement and virtue, but only because it is making him an outcast. In not fitting in not being exceptional and powerful and all of the things that the DM prizes, it forces Kenton to rely on himself more than on his community, and it unlocks abilities in him that none of the other masters have for that reason. And so here on this world, being self-reliant is more important than being a part of a community the way that it is in all of the rest of the Cosmere. After he refuses this, I think this kind of ratifies what I've just said. His father is like, okay, fine, then I make you a full master, but understand that everyone will hate you because of this, and that I've tried to protect you, and here is everything that you wanted, but you're going to regret forcing me to give you this. And as soon as he does that, so he gets the reward that he wanted and that he deserved. But as soon as it happens, there is a surprise attack, an ambush by another people group that live on the day side of the world called the Kurtzians. And they are the portrayal of them in the graphic novel, they seem kind of brutal and tribal. They just wear loincloths. They fight with these kind of wrist weapons that shoot out poison darts, and they fight with bow and arrow. They have all kinds of body paint and markers of tribal, kind of primitive feeling society. And they are extremely brutal to the Sandmasters. And you would think with the Sandmasters just raw power and control of investiture that this would not be much of a fight, that these people, are ambushing them and they would just be able to just cut them apart with their ribbons of sand. But during the ceremony, the water that they all share in was poisoned in some way that blocked the abilities of the Sandmasters. And so they are not able to fight back effectively. And just like in Elantris and Mistborn, it's been such a long time since this group has had to deal in warfare that they are completely out of practice with group fighting tactics or how to use their powers in ways that would, be deadly combat. And you'd be like, what are you talking about, Alan? The Allomancers in Mistborn kill each other all the time, starting from the prologue. But what I mean is large scale warfare. There's just not warfare during the Final Empire, and they don't know how to, have large armies fighting each other. They don't understand army tactics and things like that. While an individual Mistborn could be quite deadly as an assassin, they're not very effective against, like say 1,000 troops. And they don't really understand how to deploy tens of thousands of troops to fight another group of a similar size, right? Because there just hasn't been war. And the same thing in Elantris, there just hasn't been a war because of the potency of the magic. Nobody has challenged the Elantrians. And so these Sandmasters have been so potent for so long that, again, the difficulty and kind of depravity of the Kurtzians in terms of the ability to contact investiture has elevated their martial prowess to the point where they are a deadly threat to these people who can use magic. There's a way in which the use of magic, the ease of magic has made them soft and weak. And on this world, that is a vice, and the Kurtzians kind of have the virtue of being strong thanks to their lack of power. They've had to learn how to become more self-reliant even as a society than the Sandmasters, and that's part of why almost all of the Sandmasters in this battle get killed. So kind of symbolically what we're seeing here is that, all of this power level has been prized over pure ability and, self-reliance and self-resiliency, and that is immediately punished in the story in a very harsh way. Everybody during this battle that Kenton knows is killed, including his father, and he is the only survivor. And I think symbolically what we're being shown here is that the person with self-reliance, the person with low power, has managed to survive, and that's communicating something to us about goodness on this world. Then Kenton is found by a group of travelers from the dark side, and this is how we meet Chrysala, the Duchess from the other side of the world, and she is mysteriously traveling on Dayside for her own reasons, but they help Kenton to, revive himself, and he agrees to become a guide for them. He can translate the language for them because he speaks the language of both sides of the world. He has that liminality, that flexibility, and he guides them to a nearby city. And then the story kind of shifts gears, and we move into a more political structure that emerges where Kenton breaks off from Chrysala, and we follow both of their stories in tandem from that point on, and find out that the political situation in the cities is very fraught and complicated and layered with the language of those laws that I talked about earlier. And Chrysala is used to privilege and power on her side of the world that moves her through those spaces with more ease. And she meets a lot of friction on Dayside when she's trying to accomplish her goals. She tries to meet with the leaders of this society and is completely stonewalled all the time. She's not able to even talk to anybody face to face who, represents any of the 8 guilds that are part of the ruling body. And then simultaneously, Kenton goes to this ruling body and finds out that the Sandmasters are being dissolved as the 8th group of the guild, and that it's going to be winnowed down to 7 groups because the ruling body called the Taisha has determined that the Sandmasters are not worth what it takes to support them. They don't contribute anything to the society. They used to defend it from the Kurtzans, but now they're no good at even doing that. And there seems to be growing religious cult within the Kurtzans that is driving this sudden murderous intent towards the Sandmasters. There's been a political standoff for the last like 200 years or so, we find out, where even though the Kurtzayans hate the Sandmasters, and everybody else doesn't seem to like them either, because the Sandmasters, for whatever reason, are atheist, and everyone else is like part of the religion, but it kind of didn't matter because they earned their place through raw power and usefulness. But now the Taysha is saying, like, you guys aren't even doing that, so why are we paying all of these taxes to you? We're going to get rid of you and, kind of save our money. But Kenton's knowledge of the law allows him to point out that they did not follow the proper procedures for accomplishing, this dissolution of the Sandmasters. And so he argues that, they have to give him 2 weeks to mount a proper defense, and that uses the laws of the Taysha against them and kind of undoes the whole thing. And he also claims to the right to be the leader of the Sandmasters because he was the only surviving maestral from the ceremony that he was at. And so he's like technically the highest ranked Sandmaster. And we find out that there are lots of Sandmasters who are left. They were just, over here in this city where their kind of like head temple is at. And we also find out that Dryle survived the slaughter of the Masters as well, and that he is here in the capital, and he is claiming to be the only surviving Maester left, and that so he becomes like kind of an antagonist to Kenton at this point in the story, like a direct antagonist. He's leading a group that is particularly loyal to him and not to the values or rules of the organization. And Kenton has to kind of stand up for the rules and step into the zone of authority that his father occupied and learn how to work with the Taysha government, work within the rules instead of resisting authority. It's causing him to have a kind of evolution and a new kind of self-reliance that doesn't have to react to authority in an antagonistic way, but to harness authority and instrumentalize it towards, the use of his goals, kind of treat the Taysha as a tool to accomplish the ends that Kenton needs to achieve. And so he successfully displaces Dryle and his claims. And it seems like Dryle is the one who poisoned the Maesters at the ceremony, but nothing conclusive can be proven. And at the end of the story, where things settle is that Kenton is the leader of the Maesters. Now he's the highest Sandmaster. And so when Chris comes to meet with the final 8th group, she comes face to face with, her translator and guide for getting into the city in the first place. And all of this time, she's been wanting to talk to the Sandmasters and recruit a Sandmaster for whatever, her storyline is. And lo and behold, that, it's Kenton who was secretly the head of the organization all along. And that's where volume 1 ends, on kind of a cliffhanger in the classic like comic book style, where you need to go get the next issue to find out what happens next. And so I think it like very nicely braids together those two storylines. There's a lot in the story that I find kind of abrupt or really fast moving. There's not a whole lot of story here because it's just the first part. And while like the death of everybody in this community, and especially Kenton's father, feels really fast and maybe doesn't have the emotional heft that I would expect for Kenton, I think symbolically it's underlining the thing that I was talking about, how self-reliance is a virtue and is kind of like the reason that Kenton symbolically survives this whole thing, whereas the kind of decadence and laxness of the group overall is punished by the story and shown to be a vice and that Kenton is going to have to try and find a way to thread not only like moral and just behavior in this society that, has all of these political self-interested parties, but combine that with self-reliance. And perhaps in building, now that he is the one who has authority over the community, building a community that is more fair and interested in self-reliance as a virtue within the organization. That there was a misunderstanding in the organization, in other words, that power equals self-reliance, whereas Kenton is going to have a different vision for what's possible for people. And so the next story after this is another short story that has a more complete story to it in Edge Dancer, which is going to take us back to Roshar and the Night Radiant lift and her story. So I'll be doing that next.